Hi everyone, my name is Zach and welcome to the last video of this cute monster sculpting exercise. Here we will add fur to this little guy because we don't want him to freeze, and for doing that I will show you two methods. One very basic method by just sculpting every single hair stroke. This will also be our final result. But in addition I show you a second way how to do this even quicker using a brush texture, which we will also create during this tutorial. So at the end you will have the final cute monster sculpting. So before we get started, just a little note here, I'm using Blender 2.79 from now on. In the previous videos we used Blender 2.78, but it's been a while since I recorded the last video and now we have this new Blender version, and I certainly want to use this, because when you're watching this course you certainly will also use Blender 2.79 or higher. We have a bunch of cool new features in Blender 2.79, but in terms of sculpting there's only one important difference to the version before. The detail size slider for dynamic topology now behaves a little bit different. I already mentioned this in the previous videos, but I just want to mention this again, because from now on the detail size slider is working the opposite than before. That means before a lower value means more details, and now a higher value means more details, which is a little bit more natural, I think, and more easy to use. But in all other settings, shortcuts and so on, it's the same thing as before. So to get started, I hide the floor with H, select the creature, enable only render, and switch to sculpt mode. So the first method I wanted to show you is basically drawing every single hair with one stroke. This might be a little bit time consuming, but in my opinion it's the best way to do it, because in this way you can control how every hair should move, the direction and so on. So to get started, I switch here to the Sculptor brush, set the curve to a pointy curve, and enable pressure sensitivity for the radius. That means if I press with a low pressure I have a small radius, and with big pressure I have a big radius. And in this way I can start drawing my strokes. Before I do that, let's check the resolution. This is a slider which is now different. I use a eyedropper, click on my mesh, and then you can see we have the resolution of 64. I will increase this. Let's test 85, because the hair should have a little bit higher resolution. So as you can see, I now can draw the hair here. If this is too weak, certainly increase the strength. And if you get these edgy curves in here, you can go to stroke and try to increase the input samples. In this way, basically Blender tries to follow the curve you are moving with your mouse, even if the computer is a little bit slower than your movement. So I would put this too high, because then at some point it gets weird with drawing the strokes. But if you have these edgy curves in here, just do it. So let's redo the strokes here. So I enable X mirror symmetry. That means many of our strokes will be mirrored on the other side, but not all, because our little creature is not 100% symmetrical anymore, as you can see on the foot here. But yeah, this will help us to speed things up. Now let's get started with the head here. And for the larger areas like here or on the back, we can use bigger strokes, and for more detailed areas like the face, we can use smaller strokes. So let's just get started. And up here in the center we can disable X mirror, so we don't have this extreme mirrored version of the fur. And now you can see I just draw these curved lines here. And in between I invert the brush with Control and add a little bit more depth. And this way it looks even cooler. So if you like, we can increase the strength. And in between we can also add smaller hairs here and there. Then it looks a little bit more detailed. If this is too much for your computer, then you can also try to add this hair with a bump map or something like this later on. So now I forgot to enable X mirror, but let's just add some hairs here, and at some point we can enable X mirror again. And certainly you don't need to add fur everywhere on the object. For example, here on the ears, we can only add this here on the edge, for example, or just on the back, and certainly not in here. So, and since this will take a while until I'm done with all the strokes here, I will now speed these things up because it's basically always the same thing here. Here you can see the tail is always in the way. I'm now using the clipping border with Alt B. Select the head only, and now the tail is not in the way anymore. With Alt B you can disable this clipping border again. Here in the front, this belly and breast area, there I won't add fur. This could be a skin area basically. And yeah, the same thing here. And I'm not sure, maybe also here, we will see. Let's check this out. Alright, I'm through with the fur. Man, this was quite some work here, as you can see. But I'm through. And now I just want to add some additional details here and there. Because the fur is now just painted on the surface somehow, it's really flat. And if we take a look at the concept art here, you can see on the head here, the hair is more rough, fluffy. So I want to add some of these spikes basically. And for this, no other brush is better than the snake hook brush. Here we use a pointy curve. Make this a little bit bigger. And I also enable wake. Wake means that this thing is changing the direction with my mouse movement, as you can see. So, and now I just take a look for some nice strokes like here and extend them using this snake hook brush just a bit. And we can do it here and there. Not too much, not on every stroke, but just a few to add this nice additional details. So, and on the head, it's also nice to add this because it then looks like a hairstyle somehow. And don't worry if you mess something up here, we will fix that in a second. For now I just add these strokes here and there. Alright, now let's fix some of these. Like here, let's disable this here. Add some of the geometry so that you can't see the deformation on the skin here too much. And now we can smooth this a bit, and with a crease brush, for example, edit the creases here, especially where it is smoothed a bit. Or you use the sculpt draw brush and just draw some of the hairs again. Like here, the deformation not looks so nice. Then we repaint them. Alright, I think that's fine for now for this sculpting. I will save this. Before we finalize the scene, I now want to show you the other approach on sculpting fur, which works a little bit quicker, but I guess the result is not that nice as we have here. But anyway, let's do this. So to get started, we will create our own fur brush. For this, I open up a new Blender file. So let's delete the lamp and move the camera to the second layer. We delete the cube and add a plane. We leave the size as it is. Watch from the top and switch to sculpt mode. Here, similar to the approach we have used before, we create a plane with some fur strokes on it. For this, I enable dynamic topology, constant detail, and let's increase the details. Let's try 50. I have the sculpt draw brush enabled, the curve I set to a pointy curve, and I enable pressure sensitivity. So that means when I sculpt on here, you can see we have the strokes, and also I disable X mirror. Now, similar as before, we draw some fur strokes on this plane. So, for example, like this. Now let's switch back to object mode, enable smooth shading. Now enable the layer with the camera, and now let's position the camera. I select the camera, press Alt R and Alt G to reset the position and the rotation. Now let's switch over to the camera setting and set it to orthographic. That means we don't have any perspective in our camera view. From the side, let's move it one Blender unit up. If you press N, you can see it here. And let's set the resolution under dimensions to 1024 to 1024 and 100%. Now we have a square format, as you can see. So now let's take a look inside the camera, press 0 on the numpad, and now you can see the square here is much too small. Let's go to the camera settings, the camera should be enabled, and then we have this orthographic scale. And with this we can zoom in or out, as you can see. And let's take the value of 2, and then you can see the square here fits perfectly inside the camera view. So basically these are Blender units. If I put this on 1, we have 1 Blender unit, and so on. Now you can see we have 4 Blender units. So let's put this to 2. And also on the camera settings I enable mist. That means on the camera itself we have these lines here. And these lines will show us where the mist path will be. What is the mist path? Since we want to create a height map from this sculpting here, we have to render the mist path. This is basically the image in black and white, which shows us the depth of the image in this black and white gradient. And in order to do this, we have to set up the mist path. Before we do this, let's scale this in the Z direction just a bit to make the strokes a bit more prominent. Now let's head over to the render layers and enable mist. With this checkbox, if we then press render, this mist path will be generated, but now we have to define the distance of the mist, and this we can do under the scene tab, mist path. And now these lines on the camera will show us where the mist will be. Basically here it starts and it will end here. And with this line we have to define the starting point and the end point. So let's put this way down. 0.95 is perfect. You can see this is the start of the highest point here. And let's go to the lowest point here. And in this case, it's 0.05 because I want to have this on the 0 axis here. And now let's take a short look into the render settings. I switched the device to GPU because I want to render this on the graphics card. And the sampling we can leave at 128 at the moment. And important, the resolution should be at 100%. How to set up the most important render settings I will show you in a separate video. So after we've set up everything, let's hit render or press F12. And now this image here will be rendered and this is just gray. Let's switch over under passes to the mist path and now you can see it pretty well. We have this black and white image. So let's quickly press F11 to get back to the 3D viewport. And here you can see this one, for example, is one stroke which is going outwards. So and if we take a look on the image, this one is black. And black would mean that this will go inwards later on if we use this for sculpting. That means we have to invert this image. And this we will do in the compositor. So let's switch over to the node editor, enable compositing nodes, use nodes that they are active, and backdrop so that we can see the image in the background. And now let's hit Ctrl-Shift left click on this one a few times until we have the mist path. And this is now connected with the viewer node. Now as you can see, with this viewer node we can see the image in the background. With V you can zoom out and with Alt V you can zoom in. And now let's quickly invert this by pressing Shift A, color, invert, and put this over here. We can also connect this with a composite node. And now this is inverted. So now if you take a closer look, everything which is pretty high is pure white. Everything which is on the 0 axis is black. And in between we have this smooth gradient, the smooth transition. And if we then translate this into 3D, we have basically the same shape as we have sculpted onto the plane. Now let's switch over to the UV image editor. Then let's quickly switch over to the viewer node here and then we have the final result. Go down here to image, save as image or press F3. Then call it Fur Brush. Down here let's choose PNG, 16-bit and black and white and save as image. If you like, you can also save the blend file if you want to create other brushes in the future. Then you don't have to recreate the whole setup again and again. You just replace the strokes here with objects or whatever you like and render out your brushes. Alright, now let's use this brush inside Blender. So I open up the creature without the sculpted fur so we can test our new brush. I switch over to the sculpt mode. Only render, press T. And here we go to texture. But first of all, let's pick the sculpt tour brush. Then we go to texture, new, call this fur. Then we go over here to the properties, editor, texture. And now you can see the brush is already enabled and the fur texture we have here enabled. And now we can add a texture, open, add the fur brush. And now you can see we can use it here for our brush. If I press F for scaling, you can also see the texture on our brush. Now let's enable some options here. First of all, we set this to be area plane. View plane, basically it projects the brush from our view. That means on the side it can be stretched. Let's change this to area plane. That means if I sculpt here on the side, nothing will be stretched. And as you already can see, if I sculpt on the surface, we can see this fur. But as you also can see, it always looks absolutely the same. So let's make some changes. First of all, I enable wake. That means if I move my mouse in a certain direction, the texture will rotate in this direction, as you can see. Then I add random. That means he will add some random rotation of this texture, but I don't want this to randomly rotate 360 degrees. I only want this to be, for example, 90 degrees. So the variation is not too strong. And the last thing we do is we add a little bit of spacing here. That means the dots he is painting are not too close together. And then we can see the fur even better. So let's try 50. I think that's fine. So dynamic topology is enabled. Resolution, let's set to 120, for example. And yeah, you can enable symmetry lock if you like, especially for the parts which are symmetrically. But yeah, you can also disable this if you like. Then I put the strength a little bit down. I don't want this to be too strong. I enable accumulate, and now we basically can draw the fur. And this we can do even with the mouse if we like, but I use the pen. And as you can see, this is working quite nice. And if the rotation is too much for you, simply put down the random rotation or disable this completely if you like. Yeah, and as you can see, now we can quickly add this fur. And it's also looking quite nice. And certainly you can combine both methods. For larger areas, use this method, and for smaller areas where you have to define the fur even better, you can use the other method. Yeah, and in this way we quickly can add fur to the whole creature. And as you can see, this works much faster than the method I have showed you before. And certainly you can create multiple brushes and switch them from time to time so that the curvature of the strokes here are not always the same. And certainly you also can use the snake hook method I showed you at the end of the other method. So you can combine all these stuff to make your perfect fur. Yeah. So I don't want to drive this too far because I already sculpted the whole fur on the whole creature. I just wanted to show you this so you get an idea what else you can do to speed up the process and maybe to do some other nice stuff. Certainly you not only can draw fur in this way, you also can create a scales brush, for example, if you create a dinosaur or anything like this, and then sculpt scales. In this case, this really makes sense and is very useful, I think. Certainly you can't only create this with Blender, you can also use a black and white texture of an image, of a skin, for example. There are many possibilities you can use. Alright, you now have an idea how to use this. Now let's get back to our previous sculpting. So basically we're done with this video, but the last thing I want to do is to adjust the scaling of this creature. Because when we are going over to procedural shading and so on, it's nice to have this creature in a right size. Right now, this creature, if we are switching over to the metric units, for example, you can see this thing here is only 3 meters high. It's not a little cute creature, it's a giant monster. So let's scale this down. First of all, I select everything here because the eyes are separate. Then I set the pivot point to 3D cursor. Now let's scale this down. I don't know, the thing is maybe 50 centimeter high, something like this. And I now apply the scaling. Since our scale factor is 0 dot something, it's always good to press Ctrl A and then hit scale. So the scale factor is set back to 1, because otherwise this will also affect, for example, modifiers or also procedural textures. So this is something you should take care about. Then let's take a look at the eyes. Here we have a mirror modifier. I apply this and the subsurf modifier can stay. Let's add the smooth shading to the eyes. For the creature it's already enabled. And now let's add a little socket here. For this I add a cylinder. Scale this down in edit mode, not in object mode, so we don't change the scale factor. Move it down a bit, something like this. Now let's add the bevel modifier. Set the limit method to angle. Decrease this value a bit, something like this. Now let's add the subdivision surface modifier. And now you can see this looks a little bit strange. So let's add an edge split modifier and move it over the subsurf modifier. And now this looks fine. Now you can see we have this super round smooth cylinder with the nice bevel edge and also the subsurf for the smoothness. Then we can add the smooth shading, and now we can decide in edit mode how large this should be or how deep. And let's set the pivot point back to median point. So last thing I do is I select the eyes, the creature, and this cylinder here, Ctrl P, and set parent to object. That means if I move the cylinder, the creature is moving with it. Up here, let's switch to the outliner and let's rename this stuff. We also have the plane we can delete. Then we have the eyes, the creature, and this we call socket. So now let's move this up, and we can also add a camera. With Ctrl Alt number pad 0, I can place the camera to my current location, and now with Shift F I just move it a little bit around so that I have a good view of my little creature here. Something like this. Alright guys, that's it with our first exercise on sculpting this little cute monster here. By now you should have a good understanding on how to use dynamic topology to sculpt these static figures. Certainly this is also the foundation if you want to sculpt a creature or a character for production. Just sculpt everything in a T-pose, but yeah, this is not what we will cover in this tutorial. So this little creature here you just can use for static renders, or if you want to print this as real 3D object. And if you want to add a little bit shading and so on to this little creature so that it looks even nicer, check out the chapter about procedural shading, which will be perfect for this character. So, thanks for watching, and let's go on with the next exercise in the next chapter.